A slap across the face, loud, sudden, and public. A white cop thinking he could silence a black woman with force, but he had no idea who she was, the newly appointed chief judge of the Regional Ethics Council. And within minutes, everything he thought was untouchable, his badge, his precinct, his allies began to crumble. This isn't just a story about one officer's mistake. It's about a woman who turned quiet strength into unstoppable justice, exposing an entire system of lies, cover-ups, and abuse of power. What happens next is a chain reaction no one could stop, and once it starts, there's no turning back. Let us know what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your voice. It was the kind of Sunday afternoon that wrapped everything in a heavy, syrupy quiet, the kind where time moved slow like honey poured too thick. The courthouse annex sat on the edge of town, half forgotten behind an old grocery store, its faded bricks dulled by decades of sun and silence. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for the steady hum of cicadas echoing through the trees and the occasional thump of a car door slamming shut in the distance. Heat shimmered above the asphalt, and a stale breeze drifted through carrying the scent of hot tar and old pine needles. Celeste Merriweather stepped out of her gray sedan with the quiet deliberation of someone who had learned to move through the world without asking for permission. 62 years old, tall, with a strong posture shaped by years behind closed courtroom doors, she adjusted her simple gray dress and reached into the back seat for her leather-bound folder. Her shoes, low-heeled and practical, clicked softly against the pavement as she walked, each step steady, each breath controlled. She didn't need anyone to notice her, but if they did, they would see nothing remarkable. And that was the point. The courthouse itself seemed to lean into the silence, its glass doors reflecting the hard sunlight like mirrors that refused to show anything clearly. Celeste paused just outside her hand, resting briefly on the warm metal railing as she looked up at the building. From behind a nearby patrol car, a figure shifted. The engine was still running its low, idle purring like a warning. She felt it more than heard it, a presence watching her, measuring her, weighing something unspoken. "Excuse me, ma'am," came a voice, loud, not curious but interrogative, already carrying a hint of suspicion. She turned slowly, deliberately to face him. A white officer, mid-40s with mirrored sunglasses and a buzz cut that spoke of control and confidence, leaned out from behind the door. His badge caught the sun flashing briefly. His eyes, hidden behind the lenses, scanned her like a scanner looking for the error code. Celeste didn't flinch. "Good afternoon," she said, calmly, her voice low but firm. "I'm here for the 3:30 traffic hearing. Just observing." She held up the folder, not too high, not too obvious. She knew better than to over-explain. He stepped fully into view, arms crossed. "This lot's for authorized personnel." "You lost, ma'am." His tone lingered on the last word, like it tasted bad. She took a slow breath. "No, officer. I parked legally. I'm heading in now." He didn't move, but his jaw tightened. A moment passed, thick leaden. The cicadas buzzed louder, like an alarm only she could hear. In another lifetime, in another skin, she might have walked away, but now, in this moment, she simply nodded politely and continued toward the entrance. Behind her, the officer muttered something under his breath, something not meant to be heard but loud enough to land with weight. She didn't respond. The rhythm of her footsteps didn't change, but the folder in her hand grew heavier, somehow like it knew what was coming. The lobby was dim and quiet, the fluorescence above flickering with age. A security guard nodded to her without standing. She returned the nod, walking past the metal detector without needing direction. Everything felt hollow inside the building, like a shell that used to hold justice but had been emptied by repetition and disrepair. In the hallway, Celeste paused by a faded bulletin board, scanning the names on the docket. The folder in her hand held summaries, timelines, one particular case circled in red. She wasn't here for spectacle. She was here because the system had slipped too far out of alignment, and someone needed to witness it happen. From the windows, she caught a glimpse of the parking lot again. The patrol car was still there, the officer still watching. She wondered if he was the kind of man who memorized license plates for fun, or if he'd already called something in. It didn't matter. As she stood there reading, she felt the weight of 100 invisible eyes pressing on her skin, memories, expectations, and the long shadow of knowing exactly what people see when they look at a black woman who doesn't smile first. Her mother used to tell her, "You don't walk into power, baby, you carry it." Celeste carried it now, but not as a weapon, as proof. Proof that she had every right to be there, every right to observe, every right to walk into that courtroom with her head high and her silence intact. And still, as the old clock above the door ticked closer to 3:30, she felt something familiar crawl beneath her ribs. Not fear, but that slow-burning warning all black women learn to heed. Something was off, and she knew better than to ignore it. He saw her the moment she stepped out of the shadows by the courthouse wall, the sun hitting the gray of her dress like a dull blade, and something in him stiffened, not fear, not curiosity, but that quick snap judgment some men wear like a badge. Officer Darren Colt had been stationed at that annex long enough to memorize every face that passed through on a typical day, and this woman walking with calm shoulders and unreadable eyes didn't match the type he thought belonged. There. He leaned against the squad car, arms folded tight across his chest, his gaze tracking her like a hawk, watching something that didn't belong in its field. She didn't flinch, didn't glance his way again. After that first nod, didn't stop to ask directions or seek approval, and it was that refusal to defer to soften herself for him that set something off inside him. There was a rhythm to her stride that irked him, like she knew exactly where she was going and didn't need a damn thing from him to get there. He shifted his stance and adjusted his belt, letting the weight of the badge, the uniform, and the years of unchecked authority settle heavy on his posture. "Hey," he called out, voice loud enough to cut through the thickness of the air. "You heading somewhere, ma'am?" There was an edge in the word ma'am, stretched out just enough to hint that he wasn't really offering respect. Celeste stopped, slowly turned her head, and looked over her shoulder. Not startled, not hostile, just composed, like she was used to men trying to put her on trial with their tone alone. "I have a hearing to observe," she said, her voice steady as polished stone. She held the folder slightly forward, not in defense but as quiet evidence that she belonged here. Colt didn't even glance at the folder. He walked closer instead, his boots scraping against the pavement, sunglasses catching the sun in short bursts. "This entrance is restricted today. Public's supposed to use the south side," he lied, even though he knew well enough the sign by the steps said otherwise. Celeste looked past him at the door, then back into his face. "There was no signage," she replied. "And the south side entrance is chained shut." He chuckled low and unpleasant. "Must have been a mistake. Still, I can't let folks go wandering wherever they please. Not with the kind of threats we've been getting." He tilted his head, letting the sentence hang there, watching her for signs of compliance. She took a breath, slow and deep a breath, not of fear, but of calculation, the kind taken by women who've had to weigh every word before it leaves their mouth for decades. "I understand your concern," she said. "But I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just here to observe. I do this often." That should have been the end of it. Should have been enough for a man with any measure of sense or decency. But something about the calm in her voice, something about how she didn't apologize or shrink, tied a knot in his chest. He didn't know how to name. So instead of stepping back, Colt moved closer, standing now just a few feet from her, invading the space between authority and aggression. A move sharpened by habit more than thought. "You do this often," he repeated, mock surprise curling in his voice. "What exactly is this, ma'am?" He took a small step forward, not big enough to trigger protocol, but enough to turn presence into pressure. Celeste didn't step back. She kept her gaze steady, the kind of look that holds its own courtroom. "Observing due process," she said. "It's my right." Colt's jaw worked. The sun caught on the sweat beginning to purl at his temple, though the day wasn't hot enough to explain it. "You got ID?" She nodded, opening the folder carefully, revealing a bar-certified court observer ID with her full name, photograph, and clearance. She extended it with 2 fingers, the gesture polite, professional. But Colt didn't take it. He glanced at it, scoffed, then slapped the folder out of her hand. Papers fluttered across the pavement like startled birds. Pages, lifting, spinning, landing, face down in dirt and sunlight. Celeste blinked her lips, parting slightly, not from surprise but disappointment, the kind that runs so deep it stops short of showing. She knelt slowly, calmly, and began gathering the papers one by one. Her movements deliberate, her breathing controlled. Her hands didn't shake. Colt stood over her, watching, not speaking, as if daring her to react. The cicadas buzzed louder again, the air thickening with something unspoken. She reached for a document near his boot, and for a moment he didn't move, just kept his foot planted inches from her fingers. Then he shifted, not stepping aside, but making her wait, making her feel the decision hang in the air between them. When she finally stood, folder cradled again in her arms, she met his eyes, unflinching, unreadable, and said nothing. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say more, but couldn't find the thread. She stepped around him and walked toward the door without another word, her silence louder than any protest. And Colt stood there, hands on his hips, staring after her, chest tight with something he couldn't name, because for all his uniform and badge and bluster, he had the sudden sinking feeling that he'd just picked a fight with someone whose story didn't end here. She didn't expect an apology, not from him, not today, not in this place. But what came next wasn't just about disrespect. It was something colder, something that cracked the air in half like dry bone. As Celeste bent to pick up the last of her scattered papers, she felt him step closer again, his boots scraping across the concrete, stopping just behind her left shoulder. There was no sound from inside the courthouse, no passing voices or echoing footsteps, only the steady hum of the idling cruiser and the rising pitch of cicadas buzzing in the trees above, screaming for a silence that refused to come. She reached for the last page, one of the affidavits she'd flagged earlier, the edge already creased, where his boot had grazed it, and as her fingers closed around it, she sensed the shift in his breath, the pause, the slow draw of air through clenched teeth, like someone working up to something he knew was wrong but couldn't resist doing. Before she could straighten up, his hand shot forward, and without warning he grabbed her face, thick fingers digging into the flesh of her cheeks, forcing her mouth closed in one swift, brutal motion. "Keep your mouth shut," he hissed, his voice low, angry, and intimate, like he was daring her to make this public. "You think that badge in your folder makes you special?" For a second, just a second, she froze, not in fear, but in disbelief, because it had been years since someone had dared to touch her that way. The pressure of his grip pressed into her skin, turning her breath shallow, not from pain, but from the sick recognition that this man didn't see her as human, just a target for humiliation, a thing to discipline for not knowing her place. She didn't resist, not yet. She let her eyes settle into his slow and unblinking, the kind of look that holds not rage, but something older, more dangerous clarity. He flinched almost imperceptibly, but held on. His thumb trembled slightly at the edge of her lip, and in that micro-movement she read everything: insecurity, hatred, doubt, and the fragile fear that he'd gone too far and couldn't take it back. Behind them, a car passed on the far end of the lot, but it might as well have been miles away. A faint clicking sound echoed in the distance, heels on tile maybe, but neither of them moved. Her hand, still holding the folder, remained pinned to her chest, close to the memory of breath, close to dignity that couldn't be taken, only bruised. She spoke through the pressure of his hand, the words muffled but unmistakably clear. "Take your hand off me." He didn't at first. He stared, lips parted slightly, breath quickening. Maybe he thought she would shout. Maybe he expected her to scream or shove him or run, but she didn't do any of that. She just stared still and grounded like an old oak and waited. And that unnerved him more than any act of defiance ever could. Finally, he pulled back, wiping his hand on the side of his uniform like her skin had stained him. "You people," he muttered, shaking his head. "Always acting like the world owes you something." She blinked once slowly, the red marks of his fingers now printed across her face like a warning flung from history. She said nothing, just lifted the folder again, adjusted the papers inside, with quiet grace, and stood upright. There was a stillness in her now, but it wasn't passive. It was sharp, collected, almost surgical, as though she had just catalogued everything about him and stored it in a place he'd never be able to reach. Behind her, the courthouse doors hissed as they opened, and the sound of footsteps grew louder, measured, official. She didn't turn to see who was coming. She didn't need to. Every inch of her had already recalibrated, already mapped out the next 10 minutes, like she was preparing to deliver closing arguments in a case that had suddenly taken on national weight. He watched her walk away toward the entrance, not fast, not slow, but with a kind of gravity that unsettled him. For a second he reached toward his radio, then thought better of it. His fingers hovered over the mic before retreating like they'd touched something hot. And she, Celeste, didn't look back, didn't check to see if anyone had witnessed what had just occurred. She didn't need the confirmation, because the bruising heat along her cheek, the ache in her jaw, the bitter taste of injustice at the back of her throat, those things were more than enough proof. She crossed the threshold of the courthouse, as if stepping into court not as an observer anymore, but as something far more dangerous to men like him, a witness with power, a woman not interested in revenge, but in the long, meticulous accounting of wrongs. And behind her, Officer Darren Colt stood in the blinding light of a Sunday afternoon, sweating beneath the weight of his uniform, unsure of what exactly he had just done, but knowing somehow that the consequences had already begun. Inside the courthouse, the air changed. Not in temperature, not in volume, but in texture, thicker somehow, as though the walls themselves had absorbed what had just happened outside and were now holding their breath. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, faintly casting a dull, white glare across the marble floor, and the smell of floor polish mixed with the faint scent of old paper and something heavier, sweat maybe, or tension that had been left ferment. Celeste walked slowly, her stride deliberate, holding the folder close to her chest, as if it were a shield, though her spine stayed straight and her chin stayed high. The main hallway stretched before her like a path in a cathedral, long, sterile, and echoing with footsteps that came and went, like passing judgments. At the far end, two men in cheap suits spoke in hushed tones by a bulletin board, barely glancing up as she passed. A young clerk rushed by on the opposite side, eyes on a stack of files, not noticing the bruise already beginning to blossom along Celeste's jawline. But not everyone missed it. As she turned the corner toward the observation room, a soft voice called out behind her, hesitant but urgent. "Excuse me, Judge Merriweather." The voice belonged to a uniformed officer younger than the others, maybe early 30s, barely out of probation. His badge gleamed, polished too often, and his posture stiffened as he realized who he was looking at. She turned slowly, and for the first time that day, her expression cracked not into anger or fear, but into something quieter, wearier. She saw the recognition in his eyes before he said anything else, and it landed with the weight of history. I didn't know you were coming today," he stammered, his voice dropping. "No one said anything. We weren't told. I didn't come to be announced," Celeste replied, her tone even but not cold. "I'm just here to observe." The young officer looked down, then back up, his eyes flicking toward the hallway she had come from. "Was that Officer Colt with you just now?" She didn't answer at first. Her silence stretched between them like a thread pulled taut, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, it was." He swallowed hard. "Ma'am, did he touch you?" The question came out too fast, almost guilty. Celeste met his eyes, and something passed between them, something unspoken, something larger than either of them, something built over decades of men like Colt, standing on the necks of people like her. She didn't nod. She didn't accuse. But the bruise on her face, slowly darkening in the cold fluorescent light, was louder than any confirmation could be. Behind them, the doors to the courtroom creaked open, and the clerk with the files slipped inside, vanishing like a shadow swallowed by ritual. The hallway returned to silence, thick and uncomfortable. "I think you should tell someone," the young officer said gently, his voice cracking. "I can file a—" She held up a hand, not harshly, not to silence him, but to stop him from falling into a system that wasn't built to protect anyone but itself. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I know what I'm doing." He nodded, the kind of nod people give when they don't understand but want to respect the choice anyway. She turned back down the hall and moved toward the double doors of the observation room, her heels tapping quietly, evenly like a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. Inside, the small courtroom was already filling. A few lawyers gathered their notes, a traffic officer leaned against the wall near the exit, and the judge's chair sat empty beneath the state seal, waiting. No one looked up as she entered. No one asked who she was. But the stillness shifted the way it always did when someone walked in who carried weight, the kind that couldn't be measured in title alone. She chose a seat near the back, setting her folder down in her lap and folding her hands over it. She didn't touch her face. She didn't adjust her posture. She simply sat quiet, still, and watching. And in that silence, in that motionless presence, something powerful began to settle into the room, something the others couldn't name but instinctively respected. It was the presence of someone who had seen too much, held too much in, and come here, not for revenge but for record, for witness, for justice, not the kind written in law books but the kind etched into bone. The moment Celeste entered the courtroom, something in the atmosphere shifted, not with a bang, not with any announcement or raised voice, but with a kind of quiet authority that made people straighten in their seats without knowing why. The hum of idle conversation dwindled into murmurs, then faded altogether, replaced by the rustle of paper and the soft clearing of throats. She moved slowly, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the power of stillness, the strength that came from choosing every step like it mattered. Her folder rested in her lap, her hands folded gently over it, and though she did not speak, her presence said everything. A few attorneys near the front exchanged glances, faint recognition passing between them, faces from the appellate circuit, whispers from conferences, footnotes, in decisions they had studied but never dared to challenge. Someone leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "That's her, isn't it, Merriweather? The one from D.C." His companion nodded, face pale, and looked back with new eyes. Celeste kept her gaze forward, her expression unreadable, but her mind was already working, filing away every detail in silence. She could feel the bruise blooming beneath her cheekbone, a slow throb beneath the skin, but she refused to acknowledge it. Not yet. There would be time for that. For now, she watched as the bailiff entered and took position, followed by the traffic court judge, a man in his early 60s with thinning hair, a permanent squint, and the air of someone too long accustomed to power without question. The judge didn't recognize her, not at first. He shuffled some papers, cleared his throat, and looked over the docket with the mechanical rhythm of routine. But when his eyes scanned the back of the room and landed on Celeste, his posture changed just slightly, shoulders straightening, voice tightening. He looked down again quickly, but the damage was done. She saw it. She always did. The first case was called A Young Woman Cited for Reckless Driving, and Celeste listened closely not for the facts but for the tone, the texture of how justice was being served. The judge's questions were clipped dismissive. The woman's lawyer barely spoke. The entire proceeding was over in under 5 minutes, the fine issued without debate. The next case followed in the same pattern, swift, impersonal, transactional. But Celeste wasn't surprised. She'd read the quarterly transcripts. She knew this court hadn't been audited in over 4 years. She began jotting notes in the margins of her folder, not openly but with a subtle efficiency that belied her experience. Each name, each outcome, each detail of tone and posture. This was evidence not of crime, but of something deeper, something more corrosive. Institutional decay doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It seeps in through the cracks, normalizes over time, becomes part of the woodwork. After the fourth case, there was a short recess. The judge stepped down the bailiff, relaxed his stance, and a few attorneys stepped into the hallway to make calls. Celeste remained seated. She didn't stretch or fidget. She simply stared ahead, eyes distant, as though seeing something that hadn't happened yet but would. It was then that a middle-aged court clerk entered quietly from the side door, holding a small envelope addressed in pen. She paused when she saw Celeste blinked, then approached with hesitation. "Judge Merriweather," she asked, her voice soft, uncertain. "This was left for you at the front desk." Celeste looked up slowly, took the envelope with a polite nod, and turned it over in her hand. No return name, just her own written in clean, deliberate script. She waited until the clerk had stepped away before sliding her finger under the flap and opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed unsigned but unmistakably purposeful. "He's not alone. Colt was protected. Start with traffic court records, week of the 12th of March. Follow the dismissals." No signature, no plea for help. Just facts delivered like a hand, slipping her the first stone in a wall ready to fall. She folded the note, placed it inside the folder, and closed it carefully. Her heartbeat didn't rise, her breath didn't change, but somewhere deep inside the wheels had turned. She stood slowly, gathering her things, and walked toward the exit with quiet resolve. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. But several people watched her go, not because she had raised her voice, but because they could feel it now. Something was beginning. Something bigger than one officer, one courtroom, or even one bruise. And Celeste Merriweather, without ever needing to announce herself, had just declared it open season on silence. Celeste didn't return to her office right away, not because she was avoiding the questions, but because she needed the silence first. The kind of silence that let her sort through facts without interruption, without noise, without anyone else's panic infecting her pace. She drove for 20 minutes, no radio, no words, just the quiet hum of the engine and the click of her turn signal, a rhythm to match the rising tension behind her eyes. When she finally parked in front of the Regional Judicial Ethics Council office, the sun had already dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching out like fingers, reaching for something they couldn't quite touch. The building was modest, a converted historical home wrapped in red brick and heavy wood trim, a place meant to look warm and unimposing, but one that still carried the gravity of decisions made behind closed doors. As she stepped through the front door, the scent of aged paper and polished oak wrapped around her like memory, and she paused just inside the threshold, letting the weight of what she was carrying catch up to her. Not just the bruise on her face, not just the folder under her arm, but the story behind it, the system it exposed, and the truth it threatened to unravel. Her assistant Thomas looked up from behind the front desk, his brows furrowing the moment he saw her. "Judge Merriweather." "What happened?" he asked, standing quickly. She held up a hand, not out of dismissal, but to pause the urgency before it spilled into something unhelpful. "I'm all right," she said, though her tone carried no softness, "but I need you to pull court data for me. Traffic court last quarter, specifically the week of the 12th of March. He blinked. "Any judge in particular?" She hesitated only a second before replying, "Everyone. Full docket. I want the charges, the outcomes, the officers involved, and the timestamps of body cam uploads if any exist." Thomas didn't ask why. He just nodded and reached for the keyboard, his fingers moving quickly, the way they always did when he understood that the ground had begun to shift under their feet. Celeste moved past him into her private office, shutting the door behind her with a quiet finality. The room was cool, lit by the late afternoon light that filtered in through half-closed blinds, painting thin stripes across the old books lining the wall. She set the folder down gently, then opened her drawer and pulled out a separate notepad, the kind she used only when something crossed the line from professional to personal. She wrote in silence at first, names, dates, abbreviations that meant something only to her, but slowly the story began to reveal itself one pattern at a time. Officer Darren Colt's name appeared in 6 traffic reports during that week in March. 4 of those cases had been dismissed outright. In 2, no camera footage had been filed, though department policy required it. The same judge presided over each of them. And in each report, the defendants had all been black men under the age of 30. Her pen stopped. She leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath her, her eyes drifting up to the ceiling, as though it could answer the questions forming in her mind. How long has this been going on? How many names have slipped through because no one stayed to watch what happened after the gavel fell? A knock came at the door, soft, respectful. "It's me," Thomas said through the wood. "You're going to want to see this." She opened the door, and he handed her a printout, an internal memo dated 2 months prior. It detailed a request from Officer Colt's precinct to have certain footage archived due to technical degradation. There was no follow-up, no internal review, no chain of accountability. She looked at him. "How long have they been sending these?" "I checked the log," he replied quietly. "Over a year. Always the same language. Always the same officers." She didn't respond, not at first. She walked to the window and pulled the blinds open, letting the amber light flood the room. Outside, the wind moved slowly through the trees, bending the leaves in rhythm like a warning whispered through the branches. "Start a confidential inquiry," she said, at last, her voice low, measured. "Pull full internal affairs records. I want to know who signed off on every one of those archive requests." Thomas hesitated. "Judge, if this reaches the sheriff's office..." She turned her face expressionless, but her voice steady. "Then we let it reach them." Because somewhere along the way, justice had stopped being about verdicts and started being about silence, and she wasn't going to let that silence survive another quarter. As the sun dipped lower and the light turned gold against the walls, she sat again at her desk, not as a woman seeking revenge, but as a jurist preparing for war, the quiet, meticulous kind, where truth moved like water through stone, slow but unstoppable. By Tuesday morning, the first quiet ripple had begun to move beneath the surface of the city's well-polished calm. The kind of movement you don't hear at first, not in headlines, not in meetings, but you feel it in the way people pause, when they speak your name, or the way emails start arriving with shorter greetings and longer attachments. Celeste sat at her desk before sunrise, the room still dark except for the soft glow of her desk lamp, and the pale blue light creeping in from the window, casting long stripes across her hands as they moved across paper. She'd spent most of the night reviewing the internal affairs logs. Thomas had pulled over 100 redacted reports, some going back 18 months, nearly all tied to 2 names, Darren Colt and Sheriff Frank Tisdale. Patterns began to emerge not just in the complaints but in their disappearances. Complaints that were filed but never followed up. Body cam footage that was logged but never uploaded. Witnesses marked as non-cooperative, even when transcripts showed otherwise. It was the kind of corruption that didn't scream, it whispered, buried itself in clerical phrasing and procedural loopholes hidden in plain sight. At 6:43 a.m., her phone buzzed. A single text message. No name, just a number she hadn't seen in years. "Check your front step. It's time." She didn't hesitate. She stood, walked calmly to the front door of the office building, and opened it to find a thick manila envelope resting on the welcome mat, unmarked, sealed tight, slightly worn around the edges. She picked it up and carried it inside without a word. When she opened it, the contents made her still. Inside were 4 printed photographs, each time-stamped and grainy but unmistakable. The first showed Colt in a parking lot behind a closed county courthouse, handing off a small black flash drive to a man in civilian clothes. Tisdale's nephew, if she remembered the face correctly. The second was a screenshot of the precinct's body cam server dashboard, with multiple entries marked archived, corrupted in succession, all from the same day. The third was a typed memo with a forged timestamp marked as originating from her own office, something she'd never written, a fake directive to halt an ethics review from 3 months ago. The last was a photograph of Colt outside a liquor store, screaming into the face of a teenage boy who was already handcuffed, his head turned away in shame. Celeste stared at the images for a long moment, her breath steady but her pulse suddenly louder than the ticking clock on her wall. She knew then, with complete clarity, that this was no longer just about policy or even misconduct. This was a network, a protection ring, a structure built not to serve the public but to preserve itself at all costs. Later that morning, the calls began. The first came from a reporter at the Ledger, polite but persistent. Judge Merriweather, I received an anonymous tip this morning, something about archived body cam footage and internal tampering. Is there anything you can confirm? Celeste paused, then replied with calm precision. I can confirm that I'm aware of the concern and that a preliminary inquiry is underway. But that's all I can say at this time. The second call was from an old colleague at the appellate court. His voice was quieter, more careful. I heard your name's coming up in the wrong circles, Celeste. You need to be careful. She thanked him, then hung up. Not because she didn't appreciate the warning, but because she already knew. By noon, the courthouse plaza was no longer quiet. A small group of demonstrators had gathered at the steps, no signs, no chants, just presence. Black elders in Sunday, hats young men in navy, hoodies mothers holding their daughters' hands. One held a handmade poster words written in thick black marker, "Bury truth and it grows roots." Celeste watched from her window, her hand resting gently on the glass. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the weight of something ancient rising from the ground again, something her grandmother used to call the reckoning wind. It was quiet at first, but it never stayed quiet for long. Inside the office, Thomas entered without knocking, holding a file in one hand and a USB drive in the other. There's more, he said simply. This came in from someone in records. They said you'd know what to do with it. She took the drive, inserted it into her laptop, and opened the single folder it contained. 6 video files. No titles, no descriptions. She clicked the first. The screen flickered, then revealed Colt again, this time inside a holding cell, pushing a seated black man against the wall, shouting something inaudible through the grainy audio. The timestamp matched one of the dismissed cases from March. She clicked the second, another officer, another violent scene, another victim whose case had disappeared. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then slowly closed the laptop. The evidence was no longer a question. It was now a matter of will, of whether the system had the stomach to confront what it had allowed to fester. She stood, walked to the filing cabinet, and retrieved the formal envelope stamped "Request for Independent Commission." She placed the photos inside the memo, the flash drive, and the printed transcripts of the March cases. She sealed it, signed the flap, and wrote only one word on the front: accountability. Then, in the stillness of her office, she whispered to herself, not with fear, but with the steady fire of someone who had waited long enough, "Let the fire spread." By the time dusk settled over the edge of the county line, the air had turned thick with something unspoken, more than heat, heavier than humidity. It was the kind of stillness that only came before a storm, when every leaf seemed to hold its breath, and the cicadas went quiet for no reason anyone could explain. Somewhere off the main road, down a graveled path hidden behind a rusted livestock gate, a lodge sat tucked into the woods, a relic from decades past where men once gathered to drink, talk, shop, and keep the rest of the world at a safe distance. The windows were high and narrow, the porch light flickering like a candle running out of faith. Inside, the meeting had already started, though no one called it that. There were no agendas, no notes, no names written down. Just 5 men seated in a semicircle around a low table scattered with opened beer bottles, a weathered ashtray, and the sour smell of damp wood and old tobacco. Sheriff Frank Tisdale sat closest to the fireplace, one boot propped on a stool, the other foot bouncing with quiet agitation. His face was ruddy from years in the sun, and from the anger simmering just beneath his skin. "He's rattled," Tisdale muttered, pulling from his beer. "You all saw that protest out there. That wasn't random. That was coordinated. And it's got her fingerprints all over it." Across from him, Judge Harwell leaned back in a creaking leather chair, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. "You think she's trying to build a case?" he asked flatly. "Or just make noise?" "She doesn't need to make noise," Tisdale growled. "She just needs to show up. People believe her before she even opens her mouth." Darren Colt sat stiffly near the door, arms folded, jaw tight. He hadn't spoken yet. He looked older than he had the week before. Something hollow had crept into his face, something nervous and unfamiliar. Finally, he broke the silence. "She looked me in the eye," he said, voice low. "Didn't flinch, didn't blink, like she already knew how this ends." No one responded at first. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. Outside, a dog barked once sharp and sudden, then fell quiet again. The men exchanged looks not of trust, but of shared exposure, like men who'd dug the same hole too deep to climb out of without pulling the others in. Across the room, a developer named Raymond Knox swirled ice in his glass, watching the others like a man calculating odds. "You boys do realize what happens if this gets federal," he said calmly. "The contracts go first, then the funding. Then the real stories come out, unfiled arrests, sealed transcripts, property seizures, with no paperwork." Harwell shook his head, sighing as if the whole conversation annoyed him. "So what's the play, Frank? You want to scare her off? You really think she'll fold?" Tisdale rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaling hard. She won't fold, not like the others. But everyone's got a weakness. She's not married, no kids, but she's got legacy. That's what people like her care about. Colt shifted in his seat, his voice suddenly harder. She's got people watching her now, journalists, clerks. Hell, even a few of our own are starting to doubt. He looked straight at Tisdale. If we try to come at her and miss, we're all done. For a moment, no one moved. Then Knox leaned forward, his voice almost gentle. Then maybe it's not about coming at her. Maybe it's about giving her something to lose control over. A planted story. A misconduct file. Make her look biased, political, angry. Tisdale's eyes narrowed. You suggesting we forge a complaint? Knox didn't blink. I'm suggesting you create a reason for her to step back before she steps forward. Colt looked away, jaw tight, but said nothing. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping against the tin roof, soft at first, then more insistent. The lodge creaked under the pressure of weather and secrets. Meanwhile, back in her office across town, Celeste sat alone beneath the hum of a floor lamp, the flash drive still plugged into her laptop, the screen filled with paused images of quiet brutality. Her eyes didn't move from the screen, but her fingers drummed slowly on the desk, thoughtful, unwavering. She didn't know where the next blow would come from, only that it was coming, and she wouldn't try to stop it. She would absorb it, document it, and turn it into evidence. In the stillness of that room, surrounded by files, sealed envelopes, and silent truths finally brought to light, she whispered one sentence almost to herself. You don't have to scare me to stop me, but you'll have to bury me to beat me. It was nearly midnight when Celeste finally stepped out onto the back porch of her home, a quiet, wooden structure nestled at the edge of a wooded slope just far enough from the main road that the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. The night air was cool against her skin, the kind of chill that didn't shock but rather reminded her she was still very much alive. The porch light cast a soft amber circle around her feet, but beyond that was only darkness, deep, wide, and patient. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and exhaled slowly, watching the fog of her breath drift upward into the black. She hadn't slept, not because she couldn't, but because something inside her wouldn't let go. There were too many threads now, all tightening around the same truth, a truth too dangerous to speak aloud and too loud to silence. Inside, her phone buzzed again, another missed call from a reporter she didn't trust, and a text from someone she used to. She didn't go back inside to check. The porch was where she thought best, where her mind could stretch without interruption, where the ghosts of the past walked slow enough for her to catch up. She closed her eyes and thought of her father, the way he used to sit on his porch in the small hours staring at the sky like it owed him answers. Some things you carry because they're yours, not because they're fair, he once told her. And tonight, she felt the full weight of that inheritance. The system was creaking. She could feel it in the sudden silences, in the way doors closed a beat, too fast in the way good men started to hesitate before speaking her name. The file she'd sent earlier that day to the State Ethics Board, to the press, to a quiet friend in the Department of Justice, was no longer just evidence. It was a match tossed into dry timber. She knew that by morning statements would be demanded, hearings proposed, alliances tested. Some would call her brave. Others would say she was reckless. But none of them would understand the truth that had grown so deeply inside her it no longer needed explanation. A twig snapped somewhere in the trees, and she turned her head slightly, not in fear but alert like an animal long hunted. Nothing followed. Just the breeze, soft and persistent. She sat down in the wooden chair beside the railing and rested her hands in her lap. Her fingers were cold, but still. She wasn't afraid of what would happen next, not in the way people mean when they say that word. She was afraid of what would happen if she did nothing. Inside the house, a kettle clicked on the stove, automatic and precise, a small reminder that time was still moving forward, even if the world outside seemed frozen in a standoff with itself. The light from her study window was still on, casting a warm square onto the grass below. Stacks of files covered her desk, each one a silent testimony that no one else had dared put into motion. Every document she'd read that week had pushed her further into a place few were willing to go, the space between knowing and doing, between warning and action. A soft knock came at the front door, 2 slow taps, then silence. Not loud, not rushed, just enough to be heard. Celeste stood slowly, her body aching in the quiet way that reminded her she wasn't young anymore but not old enough to step aside either. She moved through the house without turning on any more lights, her bare feet pressing into worn floorboards that remembered her every weight. When she opened the door, Thomas stood there, coat soaked from the rain, eyes red, not from tears but from carrying too much for too long. He didn't speak right away, just held out a folder, plain, unlabeled, slightly damp along the edges. "I found it," he said quietly. "The missing file." The one they said never existed. She took it in both hands, not gently but firmly, as if holding it made something real that hadn't been real before. She didn't ask what was in it. She didn't need to. Instead, she stepped back and motioned him inside. "Tea's still hot," she said. And together in the quiet hush of that house on the edge of the woods, they sat at the table, the folder between them like a final piece of scripture. They didn't rush, they didn't plot, they read, line by line, word by word. Because sometimes justice didn't arrive in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it arrived quietly, like rain in the night, persistent and unstoppable. And Celeste knew by dawn nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom was colder than usual that morning, as if the building itself sensed what was coming and recoiled into its own bones. The early light filtered in through the high windows, pale and gray, casting long shadows across the polished floor, shadows that stretched toward the benches like fingers searching for someone to hold accountable. Celeste stood near the side entrance, arms folded over a single manila folder, waiting for her cue, though she needed none. There was no fanfare, no cameras, no reporters inside, just the still breath of something sacred that had been waiting far too long to speak. The grand jury sat in near-perfect silence. 12 faces, some young, some creased with time, watched the room with varying degrees of anticipation, fatigue, and quiet dread. The judge, presiding a visiting circuit magistrate from 2 counties over, wore the kind of expression only years of political neutrality could sculpt. He knew the weight of what had been uncovered. He also knew the risks of pretending it didn't matter. Celeste's shoes clicked softly as she crossed the floor. Each step measured like a closing argument delivered not with passion but with principle. She stopped near the center of the room, the silence welcoming her like an old friend. She didn't speak immediately. She opened the folder, slowly laid the contents on the table, then looked up not at the judge, not at the jury, but at the space between them, the space where truth had been missing for too long. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice low but unwavering, "you're not here to debate the existence of injustice. That part is done. You're here to decide what comes next." There were no theatrics, no raised voice, no anger in her tone, only clarity. The kind that made people lean forward not because they were instructed to, but because they had to. She walked them through the evidence footage, transcripts, forged records, altered timestamps, internal memos buried in digital ash. The facts did not shout. They didn't need to. They simply sat on the table, undeniable and raw, like wounds still open but no longer bleeding. When she played the first video, Colt's body slamming a handcuffed man against a wall, no one in the room breathed. The audio was thin, crackling, but clear enough to hear the slurs, the threats, the cruelty delivered with the casual cadence of someone who believed he would never be held accountable. One juror, a middle-aged woman with a navy cardigan and trembling hands, pressed her lips together hard enough to turn her face pale. Celeste paused the video, let the silence do what words never could. Then she looked at them and asked the only question that mattered. "Is this the man you trust with the power of the badge?" No one answered. They didn't have to. Outside the courthouse, the streets were beginning to fill. Word had spread as it always does, even without headlines. Retired teachers stood beside local business owners, clergy beside college students, all facing the courthouse like a mirror too long avoided. A child on her father's shoulders held a sign that read, "Our silence was never consent." Back inside, the judge addressed the court. "We will now hear the statement from Officer Darren Colt." The room shifted. A hush fell deeper. Colt entered flanked by counsel, his uniform replaced with a civilian suit that fit too tight in the shoulders. He looked tired, like a man who hadn't slept for days, like a man who understood that his name would never mean what it used to. He took the stand with practiced ease, but when his eyes met, Celeste's the confidence faltered. She didn't glare. She didn't look away. She simply held his gaze like a ledger being balanced. "I was doing my job," Colt said, voice shaking. "I made mistakes, but I never meant to hurt anyone." It wasn't a defense. It was something closer to a confession, but not quite brave enough to earn redemption. Celeste listened without blinking. She wasn't there to crush him. She was there to remind the room that justice had a memory, and it was long and it was watching. After deliberation, the jury returned. The foreperson, a quiet man with steel gray hair and a schoolteacher's voice, read the verdict. "We find sufficient cause for indictment on 4 counts: abuse of authority, obstruction of justice, falsification of public records, and aggravated battery under color of law." Colt didn't speak. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't move. His eyes remained on the table, unmoving. Then came the second announcement, one that shifted the courthouse from stillness to slow-breathing disbelief. The sheriff, Frank Tisdale, would also be investigated. Sealed documents presented that morning had tied his authorization to the suppression of multiple body cam logs and interference in disciplinary proceedings. The judge ordered the records unsealed within 48 hours. Celeste remained seated as the courtroom buzzed around her voices, rising in slow waves of awe and tension. Some whispered, some cried, some just sat stunned, trying to understand what it meant to watch a wall finally crack. She didn't smile. She didn't exhale with relief. Instead, she leaned forward, folded her hands, and looked out at the room, not as a victor, but as a witness. Because even now, she knew this wasn't the end. This was only the door opening, and behind it waited every name, every case, every silenced voice that deserved to be heard. The reckoning had begun, and it had a name. Justice, not in theory, not in ceremony, but in motion. By the following week, the courthouse halls felt different, less like corridors of order, and more like the veins of a system finally forced to confront its own blood. Voices that used to echo with casual chatter now carried the weight of tension. Conversations cut off when certain names passed by, replaced by side glances and silence. Staff walked faster, heads lower, some carrying folders as shields, others looking straight ahead, as if trying not to see what was unraveling around them. Celeste moved through the building with the same deliberate calm she always had, but now every step she took carried a sharper resonance, as if the floor itself had learned to listen. The grand jury's decision had cracked open more than just a case. It had pulled the curtain back on a network of convenience and protection, where favors were exchanged behind silence and injustice was filed neatly under policy. What began as a single hearing now stretched like a fault line, splintering into parallel investigations, each pointing toward a larger truth few had the stomach to name aloud. But Celeste knew. She had known long before the public caught up. She stood in her office by the tall window, watching the slow rotation of unmarked cars pulling into the staff lot across the street. Federal inspectors, plainclothes agents, representatives from internal oversight committees each carried briefcases filled with sealed documents and eyes that didn't blink often. They came not with sirens or spectacle, but with the quiet certainty of paperwork built to bury or uncover depending on who held the pen. And this time, the pens were hers to guide. Behind her, Thomas read from a newly delivered report, his voice steady but measured. They've confirmed 3 more officers connected to the falsified body cam entries. One resigned this morning. Another hasn't shown up for roll call in 2 days. Celeste nodded slowly but said nothing, her eyes still on the parking lot. There was a stillness in her now, not the calm of peace but the silence of someone standing at the center of a widening storm, unmoved, watching the wind tear the branches she already knew were rotted through. They're calling it the Ledger Inquiry in the press, Thomas added after a moment. The editor said it's the most read story they've published in 5 years. Celeste let out a breath through her nose, quiet and low. It's not a story, she said softly. It's a reckoning that finally found its page. Outside, the morning sun filtered through high clouds, casting everything in a soft, diffused glow that made the buildings look gentler than they deserved. Below, a group of high school students had gathered by the courthouse steps, history class maybe, or a civics project, and their teacher stood beside them, pointing upward, explaining something that made a few heads tilt with curiosity. Celeste watched one girl no older than 16 take a photo of the building with her phone, then turn it toward the sky as if trying to frame it all together, place purpose, truth. Inside, a knock interrupted the quiet. A junior attorney stepped in, eyes wide, cheeks flushed. "Judge Merriweather, I thought you should know." Sheriff Tisdale turned himself in. Voluntarily. 30 minutes ago, Thomas looked up sharply. Celeste didn't react, not visibly. She simply reached for her pen and made a small note on the edge of her legal pad. A habit formed over years of trials and testimonies. Then she spoke almost as if to herself. He's trying to control the narrative before it controls him. The attorney hesitated, then nodded, clearly unsure if he should say more. Celeste turned to him gently. "Thank you. Keep me posted if the arraignment time is set." When the door closed, Thomas turned to her brows, furrowed. "You think he'll flip?" "He'll try," she said. "But the machine he built won't save him anymore. It's not just collapsing, it's collapsing in full view." She walked slowly to the center of the room, pausing before the portrait of a former justice that hung above the fireplace. It was old, darkened by age, the frame slightly crooked. She looked at it for a long moment, then said, almost like a benediction, "We always assumed the hardest part was proving the truth. Turns out it's surviving it." That night, reports would spread faster than she could read them. Arrests made in neighboring counties, suspensions handed down by emergency vote. A city council meeting interrupted by protesters reading the names of victims whose cases were never heard. and still she would remain where she had always been, between the paperwork and the silence, making sure that justice wasn't just something spoken from behind a bench, but something felt in the bones of those who had once believed it was out of reach. She would go home, late lights off, windows open, letting the wind carry in the voices of a town that was waking up. And as she sat down with her tea and a legal pad filled with crossed-out names and underlined dates, she would allow herself one moment of stillness, not to celebrate, not to rest, but to remind herself that the fight was never for glory. It was always for memory, for the names etched into folded pages, for the stories that never made it to trial, and for the ones still waiting in silence to be heard. And in that silence, she would not feel tired. She would feel ready. It was a Sunday afternoon again, almost exactly like the one when everything had begun. Soft breeze, distant church bells, cicadas humming their ancient rhythm. The park was quiet but alive, dotted with families unpacking picnic baskets and kids racing barefoot across the grass. Celeste sat alone on a weathered bench beneath a wide-limbed oak, its leaves casting dappled light across her lap, where a folded newspaper rested, headline facing up, "System shaken but standing, Merriweather's inquiry redefines local justice." She didn't read it again. She'd already lived every word. Her hands were still folded loosely in her lap, her gaze drifting between the people nearby and the shadows moving gently across the ground. There was peace in her face, not from satisfaction, but from resolve, a quiet earned, not through victory, but through endurance. She didn't need the city to thank her. She didn't need applause. What she needed was this: a place to breathe, to remember to exist outside the tension that had held her body like armor for months. A voice interrupted the calm, small, and hesitant. "Excuse me, are you Judge Merriweather?" Celeste turned slowly and found a young girl standing beside the bench, no older than 10, shy but curious, clutching a notebook in one hand. "Yes," Celeste replied, her tone gentle, inviting. "I am. My mom said you changed everything," the girl said quickly, almost in a single breath. "She said you were brave. She said you didn't let them scare you." Celeste smiled softly, eyes warming with something older than pride. "Well," she said, patting the bench beside her, "sometimes it's not about being brave. Sometimes it's just about not letting them forget who you are." The girl sat, legs swinging, notebook balanced on her knees. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. What do you do when nobody believes you?" Celeste looked out at the sky, the clouds drifting like memories across blue, then back down at the child's face. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You keep speaking, not louder but clearer. And you find someone who listens, even if it's just one person." The girl nodded, biting her lip, scribbling something quickly in her notebook. Celeste leaned back, letting her body settle into the weight of the bench, letting the silence return. It wasn't over. The work never really was. But for now, in this moment, she didn't have to carry it alone. And that, she thought, was more than enough. What happened in that courthouse, in those quiet offices, and on that wooden park bench, wasn't just a story about corruption or accountability. It was a reminder of something deeper: that justice is not a moment but a movement. It doesn't always arrive with noise or glory. Sometimes it walks quietly in the form of a woman who refuses to be silenced, who carries the weight of generations in her voice, and reminds the world that dignity is not something we earn, it's something we defend. This story teaches us that truth doesn't disappear just because others try to bury it. That silence, though heavy, can be broken when someone finally stands and says enough. It reminds us that no one is too old, too tired, or too alone to make a difference. That even in a broken system, courage can take root in the calm in the law, and in the everyday acts of watching, listening, and refusing to look away. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice, about voice, about the kind of world we leave behind, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Not just for the views, but to keep these stories alive, for the ones who lived through them, and for those still waiting to be heard. Because sometimes all it takes is one person sitting on a bench telling the truth, and the whole world starts to listen.